Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Factual Faith podcast. I apologize for my nasally voice in this intro. I am a little bit throaty today. This episode's conversation is with Colin Stoodley. I've gotten to know Colin recently over the period of time that he's been pastoring at my church. Colin and I have a wonderful relationship based on Christian critical thinking and discussing a lot of today's problems with the way that Christians think. In this episode, we try to tackle one of those problems by chatting about contextualizing the faith. This may be one of my most favorite conversations yet, and I hope you enjoy it. All right. Colin Stoodley, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Chris. It's wonderful. I appreciate the opportunity to chat.
I'm glad. I'm really glad. Look, I've been waiting to have a chat with you for a long time, actually, because when you started coming to speak at our church, I thought Colin actually embodies a lot of what I want in my podcast, which is explanations that, regardless of how far you are into your faith, how far, or even if you don't even have the faith, explanations that someone can take home with them and actually wrestle with. So that's actually the crux of this podcast, is to get explanations like that going. So I like to get, you're actually the second person, well, no, actually you're the third person out of the four people that I've had on this podcast. All three of you have, out of the recent episodes, have recommended your own topic. So I figure it might be easier if I get you to introduce the topic.
All right.
So that, everyone can get idea of what you want to communicate.
Yes, the recommendation I made to you, Chris, was about something called contextualization. And this is something which really, when you consider that I've been in ministry 46 years this year, this is something that's grown in its importance in the lifetime of my ministry. And so now I find myself of the view that if I was starting my ministry now, I would be much more serious about the application of thought to contextualization. Let me just explain that. When somebody in ministry is contextualizing, what they're doing is trying to figure out as much as they can understand of the people they are speaking to, in order to make the good news about Jesus as clear to them as possible. In my ministry life, you haven't had to think about that terribly much up until more recent decades, because there was a lot more of the principles and understandings, a worldview that Australians held that was common across the board. But of course, our country is not the same now, and we have therefore, if we stand up and communicate the gospel, no doubt we'll be sincere, I'm sure, but the point is we're doing it more from how we understand it and the way we like to say it. But we are faced now with the fact that many Australians, weren't born in our country, and B, don't necessarily speak English as their first language, and C, whose culture is quite different from an Anglo-Saxon white, that sort of view of Australia. That's changed so much. Now, that means that if I want to speak clearly about the good news about Jesus to someone in Australia, I can no longer assume that they accept all the same norms and communication types as me. They no longer necessarily will grasp what I'm trying to say, even if I'm very clever with saying it. So what I've got to do is learn how they see the world, how they communicate, what the important things are to them, and knowing that, begin to flag things about Jesus which will be relevant to them. It may not be important to me in that sense of the things that gripped me when I made my commitment to Christ, but yet it'll be more important for me not to just communicate the gospel in the way I think it should be communicated, but in the way that will be the best, give the best possible chance for that man or woman, boy or girl, to hear that Jesus is their Saviour too. He's their King too. And he came to do something for them too. And it won't look necessarily the same. It may in some parts, but there may be other things, other ways and expressions of life which are different. So I think I would summarise then by saying that in the last 10 years particularly, I've come to the view that contextualisation is not an option in Australia anymore. I think we could have done it. I could have done it, although I didn't. But contextualisation has gradually become not just something that a missionary does going over to perhaps Indonesia or China or Bhutan or Iran. You know, it's not like that. It's actually far more nuanced here in Australia. So that I'm a missionary. I've got to see myself as a missionary to my country. And therefore contextualisation is one of those things that I do to help me make sure I'm bringing the gospel in as clear a way as possible.
Yeah, awesome. I actually, it's funny that when you brought this topic up with me, I sort of was in the real thick of my battle with the concept of contextualizing the faith myself.
Right.
Because I, like you described, kind of grew up in a lot of different churches where the idea is this is the story of the Bible. This is how we communicate the Bible. This is what you need to be able to teach people how to do. This is the box that we need to be able to operate in. And if you fall outside of the box, then that's a problem. So get everyone into the box, and that's how we progress. And, you know, and it kept just striking me over and over and over again, the idea of how Jesus would get people to follow him.
Yeah.
And it just didn't look anything like what we do, right? A lot of the time, Jesus would just go up to someone and be like, follow me. And that was it. There was no gospel presentation. There was no, you know, read your Bible every day. There was no this. There was no that. There was no make sure you get to church on time twice a Sunday, that kind of thing. It was a follow me. And then in that context and in that situation, that's what led them to, you know, the glories that Christ offers.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's cool hearing that seems to be something that's coming back into the church more. As you said, we've started to realize that just throwing our ways at someone is not going to make them change their ways, right?
Yes, I think for those of us who are in the business, as it were, of strategic thought about how the missionary work of Australia is done, we are looking right now at saying that if we don't contextualise, we probably have the ability to reach about 12 to 14% of Australia. But if we do, we have the chance to reach the other 86. And so it's the strategic importance of contextualisation grows with that kind of processing. And it's not, you know, the things that I assumed and were givens. Let me give you an example. When I was a young man, I was 11, my dad and mum were pastors, and I can vividly remember one evening that a man stumbled into the service at 6 p.m. that night, drunk, and made a real kerfuffle. And everyone was pretty obliging, and he changed seats several times. And then at the end, when my father had explained that Jesus had died for them, for him, for them, for us, you know, and that there was a chance of reconciliation with God now, and so on, this man stood up and staggered forward to make his commitment to Christ along with a couple of others that night. But what really struck me was that a moment or two after one of the old men in the church prayed for him, because he'd fallen to the ground and managed to get himself up into a kneeling position, thinking of maybe even having a Catholic background or something. He thought he had to do that, and so they prayed for him, and Chris, he stood up sober, and I have never seen that since, but it's vivid in my memory that man could walk in to a service here in Australia. It was in Townsville actually, and hear about Jesus and experience the power of God in his life just like that. Now, of course, the journey of faith for Australians is far longer, and so the need for contextualising and advocating the gospel to people, as Paul would say, giving an answer, giving the right answer, striking the right note, as it were. Yeah, this is it's a different world now. So we make fewer assumptions, and we spend the time learning about each other. Like my neighbours, one of my 4 neighbours is from Gujarat in northern India. Another of my neighbours is from mainland China. Another of my neighbours has been Australian all their life, and they're atheist. And then another of my neighbours is Malaysian. And then there's us. And I can't assume how to bring the gospel to them. I can only wait for each moment, think about their view of the world and work out, contextualise, to the point where I can say something that actually goes for them, where they actually go, oh, well, okay, that's interesting. I'm going to think about that. or I've got to actually weigh that. I want to know more about that. But it's not a given. It's nuanced, it's thoughtful, it's insight, it's prayerful, it's long-term, it's engaging with people just like missionaries do when they go to another country.
Yeah, I'm starting to experience a lot of that myself, in the case that, we got the same thing here. Like, we've got an Indian family on one side, we've got a Japanese lady on the other side, We've got an Islander family that's moved in over the road, and their cultures look so different, when even just in the concept of being a neighbor looks different. For the Japanese lady, she loves, like, her animals, right? And so if you're unkind to her animals, it's like you're being unkind to her, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And there might be something like spiritual going on there. There probably is. I know that they do have like a lot of animal gods in Japan. But how are you ever going to get them to listen to you if they feel like you're spitting on their beliefs and their system and who they are, right?
Yeah.
So no, that's it. It really is to be underestimated, but there is a bit of an elephant in the room with this topic, right? Which is the whole idea of the fear of contextualizing and adapting your faith looking like compromising your faith, right? And so I guess from your perspective, I'd like to know, why do you think people have such an inherent fear of contextualizing their faith and adapting their faith to those around them, when obviously, we see evidence of it everywhere, but why do they feel like there's that fear there?
For me, Chris, I think they are misunderstanding what exactly contextualizing is, because you see, it doesn't touch the conviction that Jesus is Lord, that he is the Son of God who came in the flesh, that he gave his life for the sins of the whole world, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day, just as God said he would be raised, and that he appeared unto his disciples, gave witness of what he had done, and then ascended into glory and will come back. I mean, all of those kinds of things, I've shorthanded it obviously, but you get the idea. None of the convictions we hold about who Jesus is, the Son of God come in the flesh, and what he did, dying for our sins and being raised again on the third day. None of that shifts. None of that. He does not stop being Lord. He is Lord of heaven and earth. At his name, all knees bow. And he will return, and all the nations will give allegiance to him. Not because they're all become Christian, but all the nations in their own way will make their allegiance to him, because he is Lord, and he will determine what their allegiance requires of them. So a lot of people who talk about contextualization think that what you're doing is like a seeker-sensitive service. You're compromising everything in order to get people close. The great weakness of that is that when they do come close, they don't see anything that's of lasting value. So we don't talk about changing our convictions when we contextualize. Merely we're looking at the way we communicate that. So we base it on our clearer understanding and a nuanced love for them. We spend time working out the kind of ways and communication tools that are going to help them, to give them the best possible advance notice about the King, and then give them the chance to come back. It is a concern, though. We know, don't we, that most ignorance leads us to make faulty assumptions. And ignorance about what contextualization is does the same thing for us. I think, just as an example, for a good part of my ministry life, I was in ignorance, and I've had to change my thinking because I've suddenly realised, no, Australia is a different place now. I can't communicate the gospel as if it hasn't changed. I've got to accept that it's changed and bring my heart and mind to examining the worldview of the people around me, so that I can give them that best advance notice about the King.
Yeah, there's something that you struck on there that has been a really ready thought in my mind recently, which is, I guess the way that I look at it is a concept of, rather than how do I word this? It's a matter of asking yourself the question, what is the priority here? And a constant thought running through my head is that I have a lot of non-Christian friends.
Yeah.
I probably have far more non-Christian friends than I do Christian friends. So for me, non-Christian behavior is something that I'm very familiar with, and it's something that, I've learned to adapt my explanations of the faith and my ability to relate and love someone to weave through that. And I guess the best analogy and summary that I can give of it is, if you have like a friend of yours who, we live in Australia, every man and his dog loves to swear and loves to cuss. It's, like swear words are almost a part of showing affection nowadays, right?
Yeah.
That's just kind of how the language here is developed. And so, if you meet someone and you have the opportunity to be Christ-like towards them and be good to them and be kind to them, and all you're ever focused on is like, oh, this person swears. How do I get them to stop swearing? I need to let them know they shouldn't be swearing anymore. I need to stop them from swearing in the Lord's name, please. This sort of thing. There's a huge opportunity you've lost there, because it's almost like you've lost sight of the greater priority. It's like, why, even if they did listen, why give them the ability to control their tongue when rather you could give them the way forward to meet Jesus, and then the rest would follow, And so, yeah, that's always been a ready thought in my head of, there's so many people who I probably would have just warded away from my life and kicked out of my life if I was just so focused on what they were doing that was countercultural to me or against my system of belief.
I think that's a very ready issue for Christians now. Not very long ago, I was chatting with someone who's not a Christian, atheist, great straight atheist, but a lovely person. And I've just created friendships with her. And so, in conversation comes out that she starts swearing, and then she pauses and, I guess it would be better if I didn't do that with you present. And then she'd call me something like Padre, I think. Now, another case in point is just on Friday, I had some work done, and the young man who had come, apologised for being late, and he said, I've had some things stolen from me and so on. And so I said, now, as a Christian man, I'm going to be praying about that God will provide you with that back. And he texted me on Monday morning with the picture of the thing that had been stolen. He says, hey, your prayers worked. And I've often thought to pray for him since, because that kind of thing, touching on the issue for that person and bringing a sense of your interest in that, and that you would apply your prayers and faith to that, it can also be another friendship, love, understanding, recognising what's important. All these kinds of things help us to actually bring the gospel. And when so it works out on an individual level, but I've just finished a PhD on church planting, and it comes up again and again there as well. So in Australia, we just simply have to see ourselves as missionaries. And I think one of the best things that Australians can do is actually, if they know someone who's a missionary, or who's back on homeland furlough, or who's retired now, I think that they can be very helpful, those people, because they've had to do this. They've had to work out what's the best way for me to bring the good news about Jesus to these people who can't speak my language, who don't have my culture, I'm living a long way from where all my security is. How do I reach them? Chris, these are practical things that we can do on an individual level, which then can really equip us to be far more effective, getting the 86% that is really beyond us if we don't contextualise. In fact, I would go so far as to say, now I know the figures, we need some research on it to actually nail the figure, but I think it's about right based on what I've observed. And so I'm saying, well, if we want to reach the whole of Australia, we must contextualise. There isn't a choice about that. And I think we're learning that and coming to terms with it.
Yeah, I was actually, you already started talking about it when you mentioned having a missionary that you can chat to or something.
Yeah.
I guess my next question was going to be, if you have advice to the believer who, grew up in a situation like we did, where the faith is delivered in a neat box and you must fit in that box if you want to be in the faith. If you have advice to get the Christian to hit the ground running in this direction, how would you begin someone on that journey of learning to contextualize their faith and navigating, communicating the faith in a way that's actually applicable to those around them?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Historically, we in this country, the church in this country, has not been as effective with its discipleship process. You see, if we do discipleship well, we're building a discerning process in them so that they can, through the Word and by the Spirit, begin to discern what God is saying to them at any given time about almost anything. But the other side of that is the doing. How do I learn the way of Jesus to the point where I do it instinctively? That's the discipleship process. Now I can remember now, as I look back, I can recall how we got in the late 80s in this country. We, particularly evangelicals like myself, we got totally sidetracked by the church growth movement, where we thought that if we were cleverer, if we worked out nice ways to make churches really good and the music really good and the services really good and the coffee really good and all of that people would come. And we dropped or we sidelined discipleship. My thesis is that we sidelined discipleship to the point where people lost the life on life, learning the way of Jesus on mission. We lost that in favour of an academic course, which we did at the start of our journey. But after that, we just had to blunder along on our own. Now, I don't think that disciple can grasp contextualisation because it's just not that easy. Now, if you are properly discipled to Christ, where you are taught to discern him by his word and through his spirit, then you begin to realise there's a whole world of opportunity and work to be done beyond me. And so I'm then, having learned to discern, I'm now encouraged to actually do. And so there's two things I would say in answer to your question. Nothing beats doing. You learn quickest. When the Lord gives you something to do and you do it, there's a strong learning process. You know, you can look at a work instruction for your work and not really get all of it, but as soon as you've done it the first time, oh, okay, I can see where all this goes. And I think that's what we've missed from discipleship. If we get that back, and I think we are moving that direction now, we are going to be able to manage bringing people into contextualization, because they will instinctively, these disciples, if they're discipled properly, will reach out to everyone around them and begin to learn, oh, hang on, I can't say it like that, but I can learn how to say it. So I think that's the doing part of discipleship. The other thing is that I think how Christians, the average Christian can learn to do this is simply by rubbing shoulders with people who are ahead of them in the journey. Where you get your mentors, your encouragers, your models. I think that we go into our groups with people that are pretty much where we are on the journey, and we go round and round on issues and never land on much at all, and then all of a sudden we have big questions and we don't know how to answer them. I think we not only need to discern and do, and we can learn that in our discipleship process, but we also need people who are ahead of us on the journey. And that's what I think, why I think that the 12 were so blessed to have the Son of the living God right there with them in flesh, modelling for them, showing them how to do this. And even when they lost their way, when he was arrested and killed, yet when he had risen, they picked up all of that with them that they'd gained from him and began to live it instinctively. And I think the work of the Spirit, is we don't just want someone to do a discipleship course and have an academic understanding of what the gospel is. We want them to have a profound life-on-life encounter with Jesus and to walk his way in this world. That's a work that requires the Spirit of God every bit as much as it requires a discipler. So, and perhaps you could say even more. So I would make those two responses. I guess the other thing I'd add, Chris, is that we don't... Jesus himself has the capacity to be the answer for everyone. We don't have that capacity. And that's not a bad thing. I don't think we should criticise ourselves for that. I don't think the Lord Jesus expects us to be the answer to everyone's problem. What he does ask of us, though, is where I've put you, I can help you to become an answer, to become someone who can fill in the blanks. So I think that's another thing. Let's not be fearful. Let's engage this and see what happens.
Yeah, I actually thought about this today, so I apologize. This wasn't in the briefing that I sent you, but I was thinking that one huge thing for me to begin contextualizing my faith is witnessing people that I respect doing the same thing.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people in our church alone who come from incredible missionary backgrounds and all walks of life from every continent. You know, you've got people from everywhere.
Yeah.
And listening to the lengths that they go to so seamlessly walk with someone is something that I was like inspired by. I thought, oh man, I didn't even realize that you could do this with someone and that would help them, you know, with the faith. I have friends of mine who come from incredible walks of life where they've been thrown the absolute curveball of a lifetime for every step of the way. Something goes wrong, and you know, there's the Christian response is, oh dear brother, I'm so sorry. I'll keep you in my prayers this week. But it always means so much more if you hear someone who, you know, has totaled their car or something. It always means so much more if you stop and say, okay, at the very least, I could probably meet with this person and help them look for a new car. At the very least, I could probably, you know, I'm free on a Tuesday. If they need to go somewhere on a Tuesday, I could probably drive them there. There's little moments like that I almost feel like God is saying, hey, are you actually keeping your ear to the ground with this person? Are you keeping your ear to the ground? Are you listening for those vibrations, those signals that I'm sending you? And yeah, when you have a mentor or someone that does that so seamlessly, you really start to notice how they navigate those situations. It's like they'll drop their lives to be able to work with that person, which is handy because this goes on neatly to the next thing that I wanted to ask you, which is that I wanted to talk about. We always talk about, you know, on this show, we always talk about what does it look like ideally to do something, but then I also want to always ask the question, what does it look like not ideally to do something? So where do you think, or what do you think it looks like when someone adapts their faith so much that it maybe no longer looks like the faith should anymore?
Well, I hope my answer is an answer for you, but we can bat it around if I misunderstood. If you contextualize to the point of shifting on those core revelations that the apostles gave us, we talk about our faith as being an apostolic faith. Not in any complicated sense, but in the sense that the apostles passed it on to us. And we hold to the fact that Jesus is Lord, the Son of God, who comes in the flesh. Where did we get that? We got that from the apostles. He is the Lord. He is coming again. We got that from the apostles. If we go too far with the contextualizing process, we are actually trying to not so much bring them the good news about Jesus, but attract them to ourselves. This is part of the dilemma for the church. We do want to be attractive. We certainly want to be winsome. We don't want to be awful people. We want to be kind, gracious, gentle. You know, Galatians 5, sorry. All the fruit of the Spirit. We want to be all those things. And so we look at that and we go, that's important, but the good news about Jesus is more important. If we undermine by contextualizing and push push ourselves too far, what we end up doing is losing our way. And I think in actual fact you got C.S. Lewis is good with this. If you're concerned about this question, I think C.S. Lewis's work, in general, is going to be really helpful, because he wrestled with this himself, right through from atheism to agnosticism to belief in God to actually conviction of Christ, and it didn't happen overnight. And no one really, there were some who helped, but I think largely we've gone, if we've bent too far, what we've done is we undermine those critical revelations that the apostles gave us. And that's where we get ourselves into trouble, because we're no longer choosing an apostolic faith. So you get some Christians, even in church leadership, that abandon the belief in the miraculous, for example, that abandon the fact that Jesus came in the flesh, that abandon the fact that he was born of the Virgin Mary, these are things that the apostles passed on to us. And being an apostolic faith, we go, all right, if the apostles passed them on, they are important. We are going to hold the line on those things. Do you believe something else? Yes, we understand. You do believe something else. But we are an apostolic people. So we're going to hold those things because they're important to us. We're not criticizing you. We're not expecting you to adopt our revelation. We know that there's an awful lot more to it. But we become convinced of those things because they're what has been passed on to us by the apostles. Chris, we have to be careful. Heresy has been a problem for us the whole time. 2,000 years. Heresy's been a problem, and it will be. The Epicureanism that appears every now and again in our culture undermines that a little bit more. So you see some churches, they start to go soft on things. Yes, we've got a problem. We want to be attractive. We want to be winsome. We want people to come along and hear about Jesus. But we're going to have to face the facts that story that we've been passed on by the apostles, we must not negotiate on that. That is our story. And we're not trying to criticize anybody. We're not trying to tell them anything more than this is what the apostles passed on to us. This is what they said the Lord had given to them. And so I that's where I begin my answer, but maybe you want to come back, brother.
No, I think that's really good, actually. That's exactly what I feel like I wanted to get out of that question. And there was something that really appealed to me in what you said, which is when you started talking about C.S. Lewis.
All right.
Because C.S. Lewis was a huge inspiration for me to get into anything like this.
Ah, yeah.
I realized maybe in the last kind of 3 or 4 years of my life that I have this strange hammering when it comes to brilliant communicators. But I think you can be a brilliant communicator without being a good teacher, and you could know a lot of things without being a good teacher or a good communicator. And so there's this strange dynamic of you kind of have to be knowledgeable, and you have to be a good communicator, and you have to know how to hop into someone's head to communicate that thing well and teach it well. I think C.S. Lewis is someone who does that phenomenally, right? I'm a huge fan of C.S. I've got his pack of books here. I've got spare copies up there and some in another bookshelf. And I take a lot of inspiration from C.S. Lewis and from John Lennox.
Yes.
And a couple of other guys in that similar sphere, William Lane Craig and a bunch of others. Because for me, one thing that I found that was incredibly useful to being able to communicate cross-culturally and cross-situationally and across whatever else is being able to take core principles of your faith and be able to answer people's questions and queries and concerns with an explanation that is really, really precise, really
very highly precise explanations, I find are amazing ways to penetrate someone's mind with important thoughts. Yeah. There's an analogy that John Lennox gives, and I love this analogy. I think it's one of the greatest analogies when it talks to, it actually talks to the idea of science explaining only so much of our universe, which requires God to explain the rest, right?
Yeah.
And he talks about, he says, if I have my aunt, and he makes up a name on the spot, Aunt May, if I have my Aunt May, and she makes a cake, and she says, and science can say what the cake is made out of, the anatomical structure, the measurements, the size, the shape, the density, the weight, the everything. It can tell you even, how long it was in the oven for. Science can tell you everything about that cake except for why she made it. The only person that can tell you why she made it is Aunt May herself. Because she has to reveal that to us. Otherwise, we'll never know.
Yeah.
And I always thought, when you can carry in your pocket awesome little explanations like that, that really stop to penetrate the minds of other people, even if there's like maybe a bit of a cultural difference, a bit of a lingual difference, a bit of a this and that, it's an explanation that's clear and concise, and you can adapt it to suit the person very easily. And I found that that's been a very, very core approach for me in how I communicate the faith to others. My first thing is, they've asked this question, they've asked question A, I have answer A, but the way that I used to give that answer based on my boxed in faith would nowhere near suffice. I'd be like, well, if you go to the Bible, you can find this, and then the Bible says this, and then you have to believe it because it's the Bible. But obviously that's not going to fly with anyone nowadays, so you have to take question A and go, well, actually, there's a really precise way that I can respond to this, and I just need to know their heart and how to adapt that answer to their heart.
Yeah.
And I found that that's been monumental in how I communicate.
Yeah, Lennox is good at that. I mean, that's... I remember hearing him talk about that myself, and, I don't know the number, but I've listened to a bit of John Lennox over the years. It's Alistair McGrath is another theologian, British theologian, who really gets C.S. Lewis, and for any of our listeners who want to go a little bit further, having someone like him who's very much Lewis-esque in his approach, very, very helpful. And of course, so is Dan Patterson from Questioning Christianity here in Australia, in Brisbane. Really good thinker that crystallises things down to simple statements that are
He's
very,
due
very
to
helpful.
be on an episode soon, actually.
Well,
I've planned that with him soon.
Get your hats, because that'll be a very good one.
Yeah, I've got a great episode lined up. We're actually going to be talking, because he's a big figure of Christian media creation. So so I'm very glad you introduced me to him, because that's really got the ball going.
He's an excellent fellow. It's interesting, isn't it, that C.S. Lewis at the end of his life confided to people, I don't think anyone will take much notice of me after I'm gone. And if anything, I think his impact on the church is greater now, and has crossed one or two generations at least so far, and you can't help but feel that people, your sons or daughters will be reading Lewis as well, and it will be very good.
I think at the very least, I hope my sons and daughters will be reading Lewis, but at the very least, I'll be quoting him to them.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
There's
the Narnia series.
Yeah, something like that. I hope that really takes off.
Yeah.
But I think N.T. Wright as well is another example of someone who I think packages things really brilliantly. Yeah. He's got a whole bunch of little tidbits and ideas that, I understand that he's probably a theologically controversial person for some reason, but
yes. But I think the reason why he is it's a language thing. But B, N.T. Wright has, and I've appreciated him and have a lot of his work, he makes me think, and he doesn't put everything in nice, neat boxes. And I think a lot of people don't like him for that reason. They would prefer the nice, neat box with everything tied up. But Tom Wright tends to think out loud and wonder out loud. I think we probably, is Tom Wright or is Alison McGrath or are they right at every point? Well, no, we probably wouldn't go that far. But what we'd say is that they are people who are constantly asking the questions, Lord, what is happening here? What was important here? And look, we I can remember reading, and I'm just trying to remember the name of it. A more Christ-like God. Now I'm just trying to remember the author. Goodness, I've forgotten it. It'll come back to me probably 5 minutes after we've finished chatting. But that book and the series around that, that creates a lot of tension for people because they're thinking outside. He's thinking outside the normal, the usual boxes for our thinking. And so, like someone like me who grows up in nice, neat evangelical land, behave yourself or you go to hell. And then we say, well, now, is there a danger that we can put ourselves outside the grace of God? Well, yes. Jesus warned us that was possible. But it's possible, it's possible, but it's not the core of our gospel. Our gospel is not about do this or else. It's a divine invitation to love, to find faith, to find hope, to find life, to find wholeness. It's an invitation to something. And look, I can remember as a boy, being in church, and I've lived old enough to hear my share of hellfire preachers, and were they coming from the right place? I believe they were. I believe their heart was that they for them there was a sense in which they thought people might put themselves beyond the grace of God and stay there, and they wanted to try and plead with that. But I think what Jesus does is warn but plead. There's always that sense in which Jesus is, don't leave it that long. Come now. Don't say, find hope now, find faith now. So, I mean, what we're trying to do is learn how to follow a man who was Jewish, who was born 2,000 years ago, who lived in a culture we don't completely understand, who didn't speak our language, right? Who didn't even know at the time he was on earth that there would be Westerners wondering about his view of the world. He does now. He did when he was glorified. He knew immediately, but he didn't know all that. Yeah. And we follow him. We are doing life with him. And this is, if you want people to do contextualization well, don't begin with contextualization. Deal with them at this level, that we want to learn how to do life with him. That's what we want to learn. We want to do it and be real, be authentic, be believable. And even if not believable, then somehow, I can't believe what he's saying, but I like him. That sort of sense. I like him. He loves me. Yeah.
Yeah, coming from a very reformed position previous to where I am now, I certainly was in the, fire and brimstone style preaching, for sure. And it was exactly what you mentioned about Tom Wright, that not only, I think, swayed me away from that way of communicating the faith, but also pushed me into being a much better communicator and I'd say have a much more contextualized faith in the process. I used to, have this faith of as long as you're aware of what's happening in the London Baptist Confession and the Nicene Creed and the this and
Yeah.
you know, if you know what prenatal substitutionary atonement is from front to back and back to front, you're able to recite this to us, then you can be dipped in water and that
Yeah.
will keep you, you know. And that sort of faith was the faith that I had going. And I remember there were just more and more questions that I was asked that really made me, like you said, really made me think. And I think at this point I've almost become like a glutton for punishment, because now I prefer criticism over anything else, because I'm like, what am I missing in my approach of everything that I do? You know, like with this podcast, I'm like,
Yeah.
no, if there's something wrong with the podcast, I need to hear, you know. And N.T. Wright has this amazing way of asking you those questions where it's like you either sink or swim in this topic.
Yeah.
You either take that criticism or that question on and you start to really wrestle with it and work it out, or you lose your ability to communicate that aspect of your faith when someone really wants to know the answer. You know, I heard him ask this question recently when I was listening to a podcast, and I thought it was brilliant. It was all in reference to politics, and he asked the question. He said, you know, or rather, it was a statement, and he said, "We as Christians are so good at imagining what it would be like when Jesus rules in heaven that we don't ever stop to think what it would be like if he rules on earth." And that statement alone is like, it really forces you to go, oh, wow, I actually, you know, I haven't really thought about that at all recently, or maybe ever.
Yeah.
And you're suddenly put in this position of, okay, am I going to do the hard work to start really addressing this aspect of my faith and my ability to communicate my faith? Or am I going to leave it there and lose out on my opportunity to communicate that to someone who maybe is really invested in politics and you know, their life, maybe they're a politician, maybe their parents are politicians, maybe their life is invested in politics, and you've just lost your ability to work your faith and your life into theirs and show them, you know, a truthful approach to the world of politics. And that's always been a really strong thought in my mind, and N.T. Wright does a brilliant job of that. He really does.
We have, in my lifetime, we've had to work as the body of Christ. We've had to remind ourselves of where we stand in relation to politics, because through I can remember, how old was I? 20, maybe? Yeah, 20 odd, just early 20s. I remember being at a meeting of, and I can't even remember what kind of meeting, who was there actually now. And I remember a journalist saying, well, all you Christians, you vote Liberal, don't you? Yep. And I can remember as a young man thinking, really? Do we? Because I had never. I'd been a voter for maybe 3 elections, I think, at the time. My first opportunity, you know, to vote was the second referendum, or the second election involving Gough Whitlam. So, you know, that's how far I go back. And I can remember thinking, my goodness, am I in the wrong room? And I can remember as a young pastor being told by someone who I'd said to my congregation, now listen, don't fall into the trap of thinking that one side of politics is your answer. Just pray. Ask the Lord, what do you got to pay attention to? Be alert to what the candidates are saying. Weigh it prayerfully, and then make your decision, whatever it is. You know, I was trying to encourage people to be responsible with their vote. And I remember one fellow, an old man, walking past me saying, "Huh, huh." I said, what's wrong with you, George? He says, no one can be Christian and vote Labor. And this this was not an uncommon thing I got over the years. And so we're thinking, contextualizing. When we contextualize, we actually don't go for those simple right, wrong kind of things. We're actually looking beyond that. I can remember my own struggle with politics that is still a struggle, because I'm really a centre left. I'm sort of concerned that government needs to be proactive where the poor are concerned, where the marginalised are concerned. And, and I see that the guys on the right tend to be a little less proactive than is comfortable for me. And I'm not saying they're not caring or anything like that, but I'm just saying they don't react policy-wise as I think they ought. And so for me, I was always, happy about that. But, I found that in the 80s and the 90s, I found that those on the left were moving more into a view of the world which I couldn't go with them on. And that left me with a real dilemma, because sometimes I look at who do I vote for now, Lord? Yeah. And it comes down to what the Lord says. And so again, we talk about contextualizing. When you contextualize in politics, you're not actually saying, oh, that's when you become right wing and you vote Liberal. No, it's actually when you learn to listen to what the Spirit is saying about your vote. And you weigh carefully and prayerfully what's going on in the country and what the parties are saying. And you say, Lord, who do I vote for? Who do you want me to give my support to? That contextualization touches that issue as well as every other one.
Yeah, there's a surprising amount of contextualizing you have to do even for your own brothers and sisters in your culture, right?
Yeah.
There's I remember I heard this analogy, and it's similar to what you were saying in the politics world, where you start. I would probably say that you and I are fairly politically aligned from the conversations that we've had in the past, and it's funny, maybe on the spectrum it goes sort of 10 degrees to the left and 10 degrees to the right, and maybe you sit sort of 1 or 2 degrees to the left, and you start seeing that just keeps growing, and maybe you're like 20% of the way, but then the more that it grows and the more that it pulls that 20% across, the more that you're like, well, no, I didn't agree to all of this. No, I've got to find where the Spirit wants me to sit, and then maybe you're sitting more like 1 or 10% or 1 degree, and it's funny because my wife and I are both very medically oriented. My wife is a doctor.
Oh, right.
I just recently... Yeah, there you go. I just recently completed a master's in medical physics.
Wow.
And so...
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so we have a lot of medical things going on in our lives.
Right.
And then we had COVID. And COVID was just... there was so much infighting that you couldn't make heads or tails of it all.
Yes.
And so my wife and I, being very medically oriented, there's this part of us that was just like, you know what, roll it out, get everyone the jab, get it done, just do it, and because we were familiar with the science, I was constantly getting updates on all the research because I was working in government, and I still look into the research to this day, and a lot of the figures don't really reflect a lot of people's concerns, but that's hardly the point. The point is that in that moment, I really had to get off my pedestal. In that moment, I really had to get off my pedestal and say, it's not worth it. It's really not worth it in this moment. I'm going to lose all of the trust of the people around me for a momentary thing. I should just be quiet. I should just let it happen. The Lord is inspiring me to just let it happen. In fact, the Lord is making sure I just let it happen. And so, and I kind of got out the end of this whole COVID thing, and I was like, you know what? I could have gone up to someone and said, well, the research says this, and blah, 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 blah. But what good is that if that person now looks at me and goes, I don't want to hear what this person has to say.
Yeah.
And it's something that could have been avoided. Obviously there's going to be, you're not going to appeal to everyone. You're never going to be everyone's, fan. You're never going to be everyone's best friend. But I think we underestimate how like Jesus was, and a big motivator for me contextualizing my faith is always that section of scripture that talks about how he would eat with the sinners and the tax collectors.
Yeah, it's true.
And he was liked by them.
He was. That's true.
And so you have to ask yourself the question.
How did he do that?
Yeah, how did he do that? And what did the sinners because
Yeah.
the tax collectors back then were the worst of the worst.
Yeah.
And so for the Christians, you have to ask yourself the question, who do you consider the
That's
worst
right.
of the worst?
Yeah.
How do you go have dinner with them and be liked by them?
Yeah, that's
while
right.
maintaining all of your positions, while maintaining your faith, your confidence, your everything. But how do you sit with these
Yeah.
people, be well liked by them, and maintain, a good friendship with them?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that whole thing is a huge motivator for me, and a massive reason as to why I really started to shift how I approach people, because I just thought, this is Jesus in the flesh
Yeah.
living this out, and it's obviously working for him. So
Yeah.
there's something to it, I think.
Yeah. 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 That was a challenging era for us. Certainly changed the church. The church that went into COVID
Yeah,
wasn't the same as the one that came out.
absolutely.
And I think, my convictions, well, I really struggled in a lot of ways through that. But again, we're talking about contextualizing. We realise that, just as an example, Jesus in the Gospels is pictured quite a number of times saying very clearly, I'm about to be betrayed, I'm about to be murdered, but I will rise again. And it's funny how you can be saying the truth and it just doesn't connect. What people want is something else. Yeah. And so he doesn't, it must have been so difficult, because how do you're telling them the truth, but they just don't hear. Yeah. And so I try to hold, therefore, what I believe to be true a little light, because what if I've got something wrong, and what if they can't hear it? Well, then I've got a contextualization challenge here. How do I bring the truth? I don't think that was ever resolved. Yeah. Jesus told them repeatedly. They missed it repeatedly. Yeah. And when they did get it, they said, no, it's not going to happen. Yeah. So, I think, how does the Lord maintain himself? Oh, this is why we want to do life on life with him. Now, of course, we do it by his Spirit and by his word. It would have been interesting, perhaps, to be one of the disciples and get the dust all over us as we're walking up the street, listening to him talk and watching him do things. But I don't think, in essence, we're any less blessed, because the Spirit of God brings us, as Jesus told us he would, everything Jesus wants him to bring. And so if we listen, we will have everything we need. Now, that's, some people say that's a Pollyanna view of discipleship, but I believe it. I've seen in my own life how God has just wonderfully provided what I needed, just in the moment I needed it. And there are some times when I haven't had it, and that's for other things, other parts of the conversation, but I've seen him do this. And so we want our disciples to learn to do this. Listen to the Spirit, be loving, come from a place of love for one another. I mean, Jesus did say, by this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. So, yeah. Yeah, it's a big conversation, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I absolutely think that, it's really sprawls. Like you have to touch on every part of life to be able to really nail the idea of distilling your faith to something personable. One thought that came into my mind a lot. One thought that came into my mind a lot this week was, if we come back to a moment for the idea of, who are the sinners and the tax collectors. And I think in this Western world, we have this, I personally see it as a hyper-focus on groups like the homosexual groups and the transgender groups and so on. And, the whether or not we agree or disagree with it, that's a whole other kettle of fish. But there's a lot of people who sort of see those groups as the absolute sinners and the absolute, tax collectors of today's, this day and age. And I have a really big problem with that, right? Because if you really zoom out for a moment, I'd say that there's far worse going on in this world, right? I'd say there's far worse going on in this world. And so I think if you have this huge inability to be able to sit down and have dinner with someone who maybe identifies as homosexual or someone who identifies as transgender or, as someone who even identifies as like Muslim or Buddhist or this or that, I know people who they could not even share a room with a Muslim or a homosexual, or they wouldn't be able to be within a quarter mile of someone who's had an abortion or something like that, right? Like it's incredible to see that, if God can't even entrust them to sit with those people, then, how can God entrust them to sit with anything more? How can God entrust them to go mission fields into places where, cannibalism is a normal thing? Or how can God entrust them to go to the Middle East where there's, far more extreme religious practices going over there? There's a huge, I think we've made this mountain in front of us. And God's like, you've got to get past this mountain. Otherwise, we can't see what's on the horizon waiting for us.
Yeah, look, looking back over my lifetime, brother, I can remember times when, the worst sinner was almost an alcoholic, and then it was a homosexual.
Yeah.
And then probably 30 years ago it became pedophile.
Yeah.
And we're now facing, our culture is adrift, and because it's adrift, everybody's experimenting, trying to find something that works. And I'm not critical of that. We took the anchor out of our culture, and so now we've got to either go back and find the anchor wherever we discarded it and put it back, or we've got to find something that will work for us long term, but our culture is adrift. And we know that in contextualising to reach our culture, we've got to be careful that we don't make sin to have a kind of like a graded thing, Yeah. Well, you can actually get away with lying and cheating now and gossiping, okay, so homosexuality isn't the big deal. Okay, we'll give that a partial tick. Yeah. You know what I mean? The trans thing. Well, that's going to be complicated. Well, we'll just have to be loving and understanding, etc. And we do, but there is I can promise the listeners that with our culture adrift as it is, I can promise you, if we're having this conversation in 2 years' time, there'll be some situation which is heinous, and we will be of the view, no, this is the worst of the worst. this is, I think, what Jesus knows in his heart, in his own culture, to the point where he chooses deliberately a terrorist to be one of his disciples. He chooses someone who is the lowest of the low in terms of the culture and the esteem of the culture, fishermen. He chooses people who are known crooks, criminals, mafia-like figures who extort money out of people. He chooses them to follow him. And that means that we're going to have to be very careful. We can't communicate, oh, come to Jesus just as you are and he'll leave you just as you are. We can't say that. But we're going to say a life-on-life experience of Jesus is going to change you. A young man that was in one of my classes when I taught Worldview at Christian Heritage College, this is a decade ago now. No, almost a decade ago. He was a young gay man, and he was in my class, a lovely young man. Thoughtful, very gracious young man. But he said to me after one class, we'd been talking about, I forget the issue. I think we raised different issues and wrestled with it as worldviews. And I can remember him saying, he said, how do you feel about me being a homosexual? And I said, well, he said, because I claim to love the Lord as well. And I said, yes, I understand. I would only say to you that you will need to learn what I have had to learn. And he said, what's that? I said, one of the things I had to learn was if I was going to follow Jesus, I had to submit my sexuality to him and be accountable to him for it. He said, but you're not a gay or, you're not a lesbian or anything like that. I said, oh, of course, no, I'm a man, and no, I'm not gay, but I still, as a heterosexual man, have responsibility to be accountable to the Lord for my sexuality. And I can't use my sexuality for my own ends. It's not for me to get what I want. That's not what he gave it to me for. And so I'm accountable to him for that. And all I'm asking you is that you're going to be accountable for it as well. That's all I'm asking. And he looked at me and he says, oh, I can do that. And I think that's probably one of the struggles we're going to have when we're wrestling with people about issues. We're going to have to make sure we're in it as well. And that will help us with the contextualizing.
Yeah, I think generally my response to any sort of question in a similar vein, be it homosexuality, whatever it is, if someone asks me any sort of difficult question and they say, what do you think about me doing this or being like this? My response is always the same thing that I think about the Christian man who's just been through a divorce. Yeah. The same thing who I think about the Christian woman who's addicted to pornography. The same thing that I think about the young Christian man over there who's gambling his life savings away. I think the same thing about all of them. I love them all. I think they all serve Christ, but I think they all have something that they serve, and we need to reconcile with that idea.
Yeah, the phrase I use, which you've probably heard me say recently, is what's got you by the heart. Yeah, what has got us by the heart.
And to tie it all in a nice bow, it takes being able to contextualize and sympathize with someone to be able to work out what that is.
Yeah.
It's I think some people don't even realize what it is that has them by the heart until you're there to be able to point it out in their life.
Yeah. Look, there are so many stories which we can tell that help us wrestle with this. There's a movie showing at the moment called Unsung Heroes, which is the story of David Smallbone and his family, and his daughter, particularly Rebecca St. James, the singer, and her two younger siblings, boys, who now form the band For King and Country. The interesting thing is that the story of David Smallbone is of a man who is very proud very self-made, and it takes a great difficulty, great trauma, until he comes to the place where he puts all that away and finds freedom. I think we want our disciples to do the life on life with Jesus, because in that context, you don't belong because you're perfect and you've got everything in order. You belong because you're doing life with him, and he's teaching you what's got you by the heart. If you do life on life with Jesus, I promise you're going to have conversations with him about what's got you by the heart. You may say, oh, but I love the Lord. Yes, I know that. But what's got you by the heart? Yeah. It's not always what you think. Yeah. And so, for everyone listening, I just encourage you is to let the Lord Jesus have that time with you to show you what's got. And let me just say too, I've been walking with him since the 3rd of October 1976, and he's still at me about my heart. So I can't promise you that it'll ever resolve in a nice, neat bow and everything will be fine. But I am saying if you do life with him, he's going to teach you how to really live, and that will be good.
Yeah, that's a great way to, I think, sum up the ends of what we're trying to reach, right? What I like to do at the end of the episode is, if you feel like it, just as little or as long as you want, a summary of what you feel like you want listeners to get out of this. And I think one way that I like to gear it is especially putting in something for the listeners who are not Christian or not religious. Because one thing that I always find is that when we have these conversations between two Christians, we get lost in the Christian jargon and the Christian assumptions. And I always like to make sure that the few non-Christian listeners that I have, who I love and respect dearly because they're my favorite people to talk to, I always like to make sure that they have something that they can think about at the end. So yeah, fire away.
Well, that's quite an invitation there, Chris. I think my final word would be, if I've learnt anything about the Lord in my journey with him, my life on life journey with him, is that he is not a company man. And I think too much of my life as a Christian has been being a company man. And so the older I'm getting, the more intolerant I am of myself when I'm like that. And I'm challenging myself to actually live in a grace that is actually shocking, and in a freedom which is absolutely beyond my understanding. And I would say to everyone who's listening that doesn't know the Lord Jesus, I would say it's not for any other reason but that I would want them to know how much their Creator loves them. That's all. And that I would be glad for them to know that, because that's been so good for me to know. And it's helped me get beyond things. I don't need the world to be fixed. I don't need it to be made in a Christian model. I don't need that. I just need people to know that God's love for them is far more profound and far more amazing than they realise. And that my job is to try and help make sense of that. But it won't happen because I'm sort of a Christian just sitting over here in my nice, neat house with everything working. I want to get engaged and do life with people, because that's what the Lord would want me to do. So to all those who know the Lord, don't shy away from those who don't know the Lord. Love them. Love them just as you love your own family, just as you love your God. And it's been an exciting opportunity to speak with you, Chris, and to all the listeners. The Lord bless you.
Yeah, awesome. Is there anything that you have written or done or anything you want to plug here before you go? Have you got anything you?
Well, if I don't have. My first book comes out later this year, which is called The Genius in the Kingdom, and this comes out hopefully October, November. So keep an eye out for that. The Genius in the Kingdom. Your listeners are not going to want to read my thesis. I mean, yes, I've got a PhD thesis which is 208,000 words long, so I'm pretty sure they're not going to want to read that. So, yeah, don't read it. I could send you the Dorothy Dix summary, to help you see the top. But I think the other thing is that if I can recommend anything, I'd be saying, particularly for those who are exploring Christian faith or are not sure of it, I think Dan Patterson's website's really helpful on that, questioning Christianity, and I encourage people to check that out.
Yeah, for sure. I second that as well. I ever since you introduced me to Dan, he and I have been chatting, and I've been paying a lot of attention to his content, and it's brilliant stuff. It's really good. Yeah,
he's such a smart guy.
Yeah, awesome. So, just a reminder, it was A Genius of the Kingdom.
The Genius in the Kingdom.
The Genius in the Kingdom.
That's discipleship.
By Colin Stoodley.
That'll be the one.
Awesome.
Hopefully.
Great. Wow. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Chris.
Awesome.